Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members, I'd like to move House File 493, and I'm guessing it's going to be laid over for possible
inclusion, yes.
Yep, so that'll be my motion, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have an A1 amendment to get the bill in the shape which we'd like to discuss it today.
So you're moving that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any discussion on the amendment? Not hearing any. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
So moved. Okay. Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, House File 493 is a bill that I've been working on for, I think this is the third year now that I've been working on it. This comes after a series of reports done by the Star Tribune detailing conditions and stories of inmates within the Department of Corrections administrative segregation units within the prisons at the DOC. And the challenge is, Mr. Chair, that in that report and that series of Star Tribune articles, there were a lot of really challenging pieces of information that came out. Information about inmates that were kept in solitary confinement and administrative segregation or solitary confinement within the DOC system generally means an individualized cell with limited contact to individuals outside of their cell, being held in that room for 23 hours a day with 1 hour of recreation a day, except generally the recreation, depending on staffing, generally happened 5 days a week instead of 7 days a week. And so it was not uncommon that you would have a Saturday and Sunday in which an individual was in for 48 contiguous hours. And there was that, along with a lot of other challenging information put out in the Star Tribune report. They interviewed family members and individuals, Mr. Chair, that spent 300, 400, 500, 600 days continuously in isolation. And then one of the most challenging things about the story is it highlighted a few instances where after hundreds of days in administrative segregation, those individuals were released directly onto the street because their prison term had expired. And so the challenge, I say to the committee, is imagine having someone that spent the better part of 2 straight years with their entire human contact consisting of being fed through a slot in the door, putting handcuffs on to be transferred to a walled-in area with a chain-link fence cage over top of you for your 1 hour recreational period, 1 hour a day, 5 days a week for 600 or 700 days in a row, only to be released with the Department of Corrections saying, good luck, find stable housing and get a job, and try not to come back. It seems as though that is an absolute recipe for disaster and not a tenable situation. Mr. Chair, versions of this bill have been around, as I said, for 3 years. I'm happy to report that what we have just adopted in the A1 amendment reflects significant work by NAMI and specifically Sue Eberhold and her staff, and our new Commissioner of Corrections, Paul Schnell, and the Department of Corrections staff, who have worked tirelessly to come to some language that all parties at this point are agreeable to, Mr. Chair. One of the other most important parts of this bill that directly deals with the challenges that we all faced when the initial report came out from the Star Tribune is that when the Star Tribune contacted myself and other members of the committee 3 years ago with questions about the report they had compiled, I had almost no ability, Mr. Chair, to respond with any facts, data, or information. And for 3 years of requesting that information for the Department of Corrections, I was able to get zero information about the number of individuals held in solitary confinement, the lengths of stay, the how many inmates were kept over 365 days, how many inmates were kept in solitary confinement over over 500 days. None of that information was able to be made available in the 3 years that I worked on this issue. And so, Mr. Chair, an important part of this legislation is requiring the department to keep track of this data and put an annual report back to the legislature so that we who are charged with some basic oversight of the Department of Corrections have the ability to at least answer some of those basic questions. With that, Mr. Chair, I'll hand it over to Ms. Aberholden for some testimony, and then, of course, member questions.
Ms. Aberholden.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sue Aberholden, Executive Director of NAMI, Minnesota. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hearing this bill. And I really want to thank Representative Zerwas, who has been an incredible advocate on this issue for many years. And as he noted, this all started in 2016 with the huge Star Tribune series on this issue. Segregation, solitary, restrictive housing, whichever term you would like to use. And they reported the data over 10 years, and that was data that was very difficult for them to get. But we had 17,500 Minnesota inmates were placed in solitary for disciplinary reasons. More than 1,600 had spent at least 6 months in solitary confinement over the last decade, and with 437 having lived in isolation for a year or longer. Over 700 inmates were released to the community directly from solitary confinement. NAMI became really interested in this for a number of reasons. While we can't definitively say how many of these inmates lived with a mental illness, we know that 14% of Minnesotans placed in solitary confinement were recommended for commitment for state-ordered mental health treatment, also known, obviously, as civil commitment. So even by this narrow measure, it's clear that inmates living with a mental illness were disproportionately subject to solitary confinement. We also know that the brain doesn't finish growing until the age of 26, and we knew that there were many inmates under the age of 26 who were placed in solitary for long periods of time. And so we were really concerned about the lifelong impact that solitary could have on their developing brains. Research indicates that long-term solitary confinement has a debilitating effect on individuals, including visual and auditory hallucinations, hypersensitivity to noise and touch, insomnia, paranoia, uncontrollable feelings of rage and fear, distortions of time and perception, increased risks of suicide, and PTSD. If a person doesn't have a mental illness when they're entering an isolation unit, by the time they're released, especially if it's a long period of time, their mental health has been severely compromised. And these effects, of course, are magnified with two particularly vulnerable populations, people under the age of 26 and people with mental health issues. At least 30 other states, I want to remember, 30 other states in the last decade have taken steps to reform the use of solitary confinement, including curtailing its use, abolishing solitary for juveniles or people with mental illnesses, improving conditions in segregated units, or gradually easing isolated inmates back into the general population. This bill will keep Minnesota from falling behind. The House has twice passed various versions of this bill. And this year, as Representative Zerwas noted, we have worked very closely with the new Commissioner of Corrections to try to address their concerns and to actually make it workable. And we did meet last fall with MAPE as well to hear any concerns that they would have. And so what this bill is really about is transparency and sunshine so that everyone knows how restrictive housing is being used in our prisons and ensuring oversight. The bill actually allows the Department of Corrections to use solitary confinement. There is nothing in statute right now that allows them to even do that, which I think in the future perhaps could be challenged. So this allows them to use it, allows us as a state to regulate it, and again to have data so that there's transparency. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Overholden. Representative Wolgamott, Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Aberhold, do you see a need for more staff to fill the jobs that will be necessary to follow through with these changes, more mental health services staff?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wogmut, absolutely. And NAMI has strongly supported, especially the increase of mental health and substance use disorder staff, because we know that so many of the folks, who are inmates are living with those conditions, and we need better treatment. Absolutely.
Mr. Chair, one follow-up. So I'm assuming you would support additional funding for that staff.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there a companion bill in the Senate?
Representative Zerwas.
Mr. Chair, Representative Christensen, yes. The companion bill is being identifying co-authors and should be dropped later this week.
Thank you.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering if the commissioner will come down as well. I have a couple questions if he is willing to testify. Thank you. As he's coming down, I know that with the change of commissioner, we have a change in philosophy, and he and I have had multiple conversations, and to the committee as well. You really don't understand what it's like until you go there and look at one of the segregation rooms, and when Representative Zerwas talked about the cage, it looks kind of like a big kennel that you walk into, and that's where your rec time is. And I was really taken back by, I wouldn't say I'm claustrophobic, but I think I would be, after spending time in that very, very small room, the way that it's structured, no outside light. So I can't even describe it. You really have to go and take a look at what the segregation looks like and their outdoor rec. But my question is, now we've got a new commissioner and a new philosophy. What are some of the policies that you've modified or changed regarding segregation?
Commissioner Snell.
Representative Neal, we have been really working closely, I think, with NAMI. Our staff at the department has been working with the wardens, has been working with the disciplinary procedures staff, the folks who are conducting the due process hearings around the use of restrictive housing. We've really talked heavily and extensively about behavioral health staff, specifically focused on this issue. And in the budget, there is 19 additional FTEs specifically focused on case management and behavioral health, targeting or focused on restrictive housing. We have been having discussions about the fact that really being clear about the manner in which we manage people in restrictive housing. Step-down management is one of them, and I think speaks directly to the concerns about releasing people directly into the community. Where there are more serious offenses, we are talking about right now an extension of the amount of time someone can be held in a restrictive housing. And while we have not finalized that or issued that policy yet, we are having discussions, talking with other departments across the country to establish and make sure that we're within the confines of best practices. We do feel that it is fundamentally necessary for the safety to be able to have a response to the most serious and egregious of conduct in the facility to use restrictive housing. At the same time, we believe that fundamentally our goal should be to ultimately reintegrate them back into the general population, and that should be done in a manner where there's demonstrated behavioral conduct that allows us to have them return to the general population, or in those instances where they're getting close to their release date, into the community where there has been a step-down process, so that we're not releasing somebody cold directly from restrictive housing.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's two situations that are kind of on the opposite ends of the spectrum. You've got someone that will commit a new violation, so to speak, because they just want to be alone. And, as I toured all of the prisons, it was something that it was reflected in every single prison that I talked to, that, they're just afraid to be in the general population. They have great fear. the mental illness might play into that, but they'll do something to literally just stay in. So you've got that spectrum. And then you've got those that are just dangerous and violent, and your staff is attacked and your staff is at risk. And, those are two ends of the continuum. And so I know it's got to be incredibly challenging to try to come up with a policy that not only handles both of the ends of the spectrum, but everybody in between as well. Someone might have a really, really, really bad mental health day, and they lash out, and they need to they've already decompensated. They need some time to just be by themselves, and maybe it's 2 days, maybe it's a week, maybe it's 2 weeks. I don't know, but they just need some space and some time. So, I give you a lot of credit because it's a very complicated issue. It's not simplistic. It's not, obviously egregiously it had been used where, as Representative Zerwas said, up to 500 days. And that in and of itself, if just a few weeks more can go and cause mental health issues. But I can't even imagine 500 days, especially after standing in the room and standing in the area where they do the outside rec. As you develop those policies, I hope that you come back and kind of let us know what you've decided on and how you've come to that decision. And hopefully this bill will be a help, not a hindrance. That's how I see it anyway. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Schnell, looked like you had a comment.
Thank you. Yes, and I appreciate that. We want to make sure absolutely that when the policy is finalized and released, that it is it has the kind of benefit of sunshine as Sue talked about. We want the public to know. We want all of our staff to know. We want everyone inside living in our facilities to know, because there is no secret about what that ultimately is. And I think I want to draw a key distinction, because you point out something very important, the difference between administrative segregation at some level, and that is those times when, for some reason, whether it's a safety or security issue, someone is separated from the general population, or fear, or whatever it may be, a circumstance. And we manage those differently, and we would like to, they have certainly different accesses to services and opportunities for recreation and those sorts of things, versus the disciplinary segregation, which is oftentimes what we're talking about in this bill, although both of them are of major concern, and it is something that we are giving considerable attention to.
Do you, Representative Zerwas?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think one of the things I want to make sure that everybody knows about the bill is there's nothing within this language that would tie the commissioner's hands as far as setting out limits or guidelines on lengths of solitary confinement stays or the use of solitary confinement stays. It is very possible, Mr. Chair, that in those instances of extremely long uses of solitary confinement noted in the Star Tribune article, it is completely possible that in a few of those instances, or in some of those instances, that those individuals were exactly where they needed to be at the time they needed to be there. The challenge is, I can't confirm that, and the Department of Corrections couldn't confirm that. The record keeping for that process of extending someone's solitary confinement time and keeping people isolated, it was either non-existent or, after multiple attempts to gain some access to that, it just wasn't provided to the legislature. I'm under the belief, after many conversations with multiple individuals, that the record keeping just wasn't up to basic standards. One of the things that's called out specifically in this new language, Mr. Chair, is the timelines in which these issues are elevated eventually up to the commissioner or their designee with a layout of why the individual's stay in solitary confinement has been extended past 120 days. The challenge that when talking to individuals or family members after hundreds of days of their loved one being isolated for them or of them being isolated, a real I think a real fear, and I think you would probably sympathize with that fear to an extent, having been in the room and been there after 100 or 200 days, is individuals or their family members, I think very naturally start to wonder, who knows I'm here? Does anyone know? I mean, I see the guard, but does the warden know I'm here? Does his boss know I'm here? And do they know I've been here for hundreds of days? And that was in conversations with individuals following the Star Tribune series of articles. That is a theme that kept coming up with individuals and with family members. And so one of the goals in this bill is to make the accountability measures very transparent, and so that we know and they will know that, yes, you're there because you've earned your way there. And if you've been extended, there's a reason why your behavior has extended your time in isolation. And here is everyone that knows. And here's the plan to try through your good behavior to work your way out, if you so do desire.
Representative, I guess I have a question. So part of it would be then establishing benchmarks or goals that the offender would need to reach to progress out of. Oh, kind of like that idea.
Mr. Chair, that is exactly the notion of the step-down management side of the work, the plan.
Yeah.
But it's be real clear then that, you know, if you haven't achieved this, you need to work on that before you advance.
Yep. And Mr. Chair, subdivision 7 of the bill requires the Department of Corrections to designate a system of incentives in order to work their way down.
Is there anybody in the audience that would like, excuse me, Representative Wolgamott, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Zerwas, I just want to thank you so much for your years-long commitment to making these positive and necessary changes. Just a couple of questions. Do you have a sense of how many more licensed mental health services staff would be needed to carry out these changes? And on top of that, are you supportive of adding FTEs to make sure these needed changes can be carried out in the way that they need to?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative Wolgamott, the bill calls for a lot of policy changes and some changes in record keeping. Certainly, I know there are some IT requests in the governor's budget. I know there's some case management requests in the budget. I know there's some correctional officer requests in the governor's budget requests. I think a combination to a degree of all of those will be needed to get our entire Department of Corrections system encompassing to where it needs to be. The specifics on how many case managers or how many correctional officers needed to be added above and beyond what's already allowed for in maximum budget, I'm not in a position to designate those exact numbers. I would caution, as I mentioned last night, that allowing an upper limit of 160 or whatever the final number is of additional correctional officers be hired with 80 openings currently existing and a 30% loss rate on CO officers currently employed. I don't know that upping the allowable number of staff within the budget is the silver bullet that some may believe it is.
Mr. Chair, one last remark. Thank you, Representative Zerwas, and I just want to be clear that I think these are good, positive changes, and I thank you for doing that, but I really believe that they can't be carried out without the addition of more licensed mental health services staff. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Zerwas.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, Representative Wolgamott and I would agree on that.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the panel, from the committee? Sorry. Anybody from the audience that would like to comment? Not seeing anyone. Okay, we're going to hold this one over for possible inclusion in the omnibus bill, and thank you, Representative Zerwas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.